Section 7 of the Constitution, under the Bill of Rights, very clearly says that the Bill of Rights is for all who are in South Africa, necessarily meaning as soon as an individual lands on South African soil, regardless of their status, they enjoy certain rights which are protected by the Constitution.
It is only after the 1994 elections that South Africa committed itself to provide protection to refugees and asylum seekers in South Africa. Since then, we've seen a process whereby the new government developed a new refugee and an immigration policy, and part of that policy secures the freedom and security of asylum seekers, refugees.
South Africa doesn't have a mandatory detention policy for asylum seekers. We have an urban refugee policy, which means that asylum seekers can come into South Africa, they can work, they can study, and they're supposed to look after themselves. There is one main immigration detention centre in South Africa, and that's at Lindela in Krugersdorp. There is another one which is operating on the border with Zimbabwe in Messina.
10 years ago, the South African Human Rights Commission, in collaboration with Wits University, conducted an in-depth investigation into the allegations of excess and human rights abuse at the facility. That confirmed our suspicions that people are being unlawfully held at the detention centre, as well as being held in unlawful and substandard conditions of detention.
I came across Lindela in 1998. It was a horrific experience, coming across detainees, their rights not being explained to them.
I'm afraid that we have not come far in preventing the unlawful detention of refugees, migrant workers, and we have not really solved concerns around substandard detention conditions.
What we see is that the procedural safeguards, which are set out very specifically in our Immigration Act, in our Refugees Act, and in our Constitution, are not being followed.
Some of the cases that they will bring to my attention are mainly issues of prolonged detention. Detainees cannot be detained for longer than 30 days without extension of such detention by a magistrate.
As far as they're concerned, they are indefinitely detained. They do not know that they have a right not to be detained in many instances, and even if they are aware of that right, without having pro bono legal assistance, it's very difficult for them to access this right. We see that the results of this detention, especially people who've been detained for quite a long time, would rather choose deportation to countries where they might have been fleeing a civil war or very serious persecution than be detained any longer because of the frustration of the indefiniteness of the detention.
The detention facility of Lindela is operated by a private company, and there is very little or no independent oversight and monitoring of these facilities. And whereas the correctional facilities or the prisons in South Africa are being monitored and supervised by an independent judicial service provider.
In Zimbabwe, there's a lot of poverty, so you can't survive the life there. Everything is very tough.
There are those who come through the official port of entry, or alternatively, they'll walk through the bush and somehow work their way through the river onto the South African side.
Okay, right now we're driving along the border post. This is the fence of the South African side of the border. There is a border jumper there. The fence is what used to be on during the apartheid days, but since the end of the fall of apartheid, the fence has been turned off. because the South African government decided that too many lives were being wasted. People were dying trying to cross into South Africa.
We've got these people who are now termed amakumakuma. Amakumakuma being a group of people who previously assisted people who were coming to South Africa without documentation for them to access the country on payment of a certain sum of money. But then now they've become the robbers and the rapists.
Makumakuma, those people who they rape us sometimes, they take money from us, they search us everywhere. So I'm afraid of those people because they're taking, our lives are at risk with them.
These guys who you see here have come across the border from Zimbabwe, either across the bridge or through informal channels. These people are waiting to be documented. They've been sleeping here for some time now. And what happens is when they come across the bridge, they try to access the Home Affairs office right here. Some of them have already been inside and are just now waiting for their documents to be issued out.
Life in Zimbabwe is very miserable. We can't afford to live there. It's our own country, but it's very difficult to be there. We can't afford to be there.
SMG was probably the filthiest possible place that anyone can imagine. Twice now we've had to take the government to court. SMG is an old basketball court which was divided in half using some metal sheeting of sorts and barbed wire at the top. The area where the people are locked up, there are no toilets. For the women to access the toilet, they'd have to bang on the door and hopefully get an early response from the police officers. The same with the men's side. What they would do at times is give the men buckets, 20-liter buckets, and they would basically have to relieve themselves in those buckets. Once the buckets filled up, the filth would start flowing all over. And this is where they were expected to sleep as well. There were no mattresses. There were old, filthy blankets, which were hardly ever washed.
We need to have a far more organized way of managing unaccompanied foreign children. And the key to this is putting correct resources and supports in at Messina, where the children come across the border.
The Child Care Act is very clear about the aspect of not detaining children unless as a measure of last resort.
Obviously, children who come over the border very often come from traumatic situations themselves. They've come here because they're escaping some form of abuse or something frightening that's happening at home, or even just desperate poverty, and they've been sent to try and work in South Africa. So after you've been through all of that, to then find yourself detained is obviously very frustrating and sometimes quite frightening.